Democrats are better at handling the economy. Look at California. It's such a success story, and it's all thanks to Democrats like Brown, Jerry Brown, and Gavin Newsom, and Javier Becerra. It's the 5th largest economy. Take that, conservatives. Take that, Trump. What now? Well, they passed a fucking law that forces Uber and Lyft to reclassify drivers as employees, and now as a result, Uber might have to temporarily, or maybe even permanently, shut down. And a lot of other private contracting work got shut down as a result. I think Vox was the big one. Vox Media cuts hundreds of freelance journalists as AB5 changes loom. This is Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, who notoriously tweeted "fuck Elon Musk," and Elon Musk replied, "message received." So they have no problem driving Elon Musk and Tesla out of California. They're putting this AB5 law has put private contractors outside of the rideshare industry out of work. A lot of other people have lost work in California because of this. Uber might be chased out of town. This is your success story. So yeah, California, it's their big success story, and yeah, they're crippling whatever creators and builders are left in their state. It's really, really unfortunate. So for those who have not been paying attention, Kamala Harris, the senator, am I pronouncing that correctly? That's become a controversial issue, apparently. Kamala Harris, the senator from the great, wonderful state of California, has been nominated or has been picked as Joe Biden's running mate. So she might be the vice president within the next 6 months. And I guess the good news there is California, the great state of California, might have the opportunity to fill Kamala Harris's Senate seat with someone who is even crazier. So anyway, Kamala Harris is running her mouth saying that Trump inherited the longest economic expansion in history from Barack Obama and Joe Biden, and then, like everything else he inherited, he ran it straight into the ground. And man, people are going crazy. Whoa! MAGA's owned you guys. Holy shit! And the reason I bring this up, not only because it's relevant to the news, but I actually got asked, before Kamala Harris was picked as the VP, as the running mate to Joe Biden, someone asked me on a YouTube video what I would respond to the common leftist argument that Democrats are better for the economy than Republicans. How would I answer that? Are Democrats better for the economy than Republicans? And you see Kamala Harris, she's playing on it right here. And this is, I remember this was an argument back when Barack Obama ran in 2008. Because this is a narrative they have framed. And now, first, I should say two things. One, that the economy should never be the primary standard. The primary standard should always be whether or not a political party or a politician or a candidate is making you freer, making the country freer. Freedom should be the standard. And I've talked about this. An analogy I use, I talked about this, I usually bring this up when I talk about Medicare for All. Because a lot of the Medicare for All advocates, like Bolshevik Bernie Sanders, they'll try to make the argument that Medicare for All is going to be so wonderful for the U.S. economy. So great, so wonderful. And my argument is the economy is never the standard. Say someone came up to you, for instance, this is the analogy I use. Say someone came up to you and said that the institution of slavery would be great for the economy. And they had studies. They pulled out studies. They opened their silver briefcase and pulled out some nice laminated studies for you to read with some charts that showed that the institution of slavery, it's so great. It results in higher GDP. The purchasing power of the dollar is a lot stronger because of slavery. Unemployment is a lot better because of slavery. Look at all these stats. Now, no person in their right mind would say, oh, well, slavery sucks, but I guess the GDP and the purchasing power of the dollar depend on it, so we should maybe give it a shot. No person in their right mind would accept this argument. It's always about morality. It's always about freedom. That's what you should make your case on, is whether or not a politician is going to free you up. It shouldn't be the economy. And also this whole talk about Democrats, Republicans, who's better for the economy, this is based on a common double false dichotomy. So the dichotomy we're presented, the choices we're presented, still seemingly is that Republicans want to control your bedroom but not your boardroom, and Democrats want to control your boardroom but not your bedroom. And I think that creates a false dichotomy of economic freedom and social freedom, because I don't think they should be separated. I think they're one and the same. So for instance, with Republicans, say you run a video game shop like a GameStop or a used video game store, and you want to hire a few teenagers because teenagers are nerds, they play too many video games. You might be able to hire a few teenagers, a few willing teenage workers at, say, $7 an hour to come work for your video game store. Now, the Republicans might say, well, that's illegal because the minimum wage is, say, $10 an hour. Here's what we'll do. We'll make it legal for you to employ someone at $7 an hour so you can hire teenagers to work in your video game store. And you say, okay, great. Then you hire the teenagers, business is booming, but then the Republicans come back and they say, you know, what's with all these video games? Does anyone really need video games? You know, video games, they lead kids, they're satanic. They're turning kids into school shooters. They're playing these demonic video games like Doom and these first-person shooters, making them crazy. Do kids really need it? So then eventually the Republicans, the social conservative Republicans, eventually they're going to outlaw the video game store they're going to outlaw video games. So those teenagers that you just hired because they freed up the, wage restrictions, well, now your store is going to go out of business anyway because they've made video games illegal. Also on top of that, when it comes to whatever lip service to freedom both sides pay lip service to, both the Democrats and Republicans, they don't give a rat's ass about freedom. They're more obsessed with controlling your life. The Democrats are more obsessed with controlling your boardroom than giving you freedom in the bedroom. Republicans are more obsessed with controlling your bedroom than freeing up the economy. But I think a better way to frame it, on top of all that, I think a better way to frame it is the fact that government intervention in the economy is bad for the economy. Because when you get down to it, when you break it all down, both Democrats and Republicans, they're both in favor of the mixed economy. And they just disagree over what extent they want to control the economy. That's essentially, and it's gotten worse with Republicans, obviously, with their hate boner toward big tech and their obsession with breaking up these alleged big tech monopolies. And I think that's the way you got to think about it. Because the two arguments, going back to the question, leftists say that Democrats are better at running the economy than Republicans. This is based on two narratives, two false narratives. It's based on the Great Depression and the Great Recession. With the Great Depression, their whole narrative is that the stock market crashed because of capitalism run amok, too much greed on Wall Street, not enough government controls, not enough government regulations on banking and finance. And then when the stock market crashed, it crashed under a Republican president, Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover's attitude was just hands off, everyone relax, the free market will solve itself, we don't need to get involved here. And then things got worse, and then it wasn't until FDR came along and rescued the economy with his brilliant central planning. And we see that right here. You see this in meme form all the time. This meme from Occupy Democrats. I see this meme at least once a year, if not multiple times. They called FDR a socialist, too, when he ended the Great Depression and brought unemployment down from 25% to 2% through economy-stimulating jobs bills, created FDIC, blah, 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 created Social Security, which ended elderly poverty. Did it. Did it. You see, they called me a socialist, too, when I rescued the country from the Great Depression, created the middle class with the first minimum wage, all that good stuff. So you see this a lot. It was capitalism and deregulation and a hands-off president like Hoover that created the Great Depression, and it was FDR and the Democrats and their central planning that rescued the American economy. And this got worse after the Great Recession in 2008, because the narrative with the Great Recession was that in the 90s, the economy was booming, everything was great, all because of Bill Clinton and his brilliant central planning, I guess. And it wasn't until the Republicans like George W. Bush took over the White House and Congress, and it was because of deregulation on Wall Street, namely the repeal of Glass-Steagall. That all caused the Great Recession. It was too much greed, too much recklessness on Wall Street that caused the Great Recession. And it was all because of Republicans. Now, on its face, even if you accept this, the fact is, this doesn't make sense on its face, because the repeal of Glass-Steagall was signed into law by Bill Clinton in 1999. So even on that whole notion alone, it's like you can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, the economy was great because of a Democrat like Bill Clinton, and then say, oh, it was deregulation in the Republicans. Well, the deregulation that a lot of people like to cite, like Elizabeth Warren and the Young Turks, that was signed by Bill Clinton. But more on that later. Because I want to address this. I want to start off by looking at this book that I highly recommend. It's called In Pursuit of Wealth, The Moral Case for Finance. And in there's an essay. I learned so much from reading this book. This essay really talks about what I want to bring up. It's by Don Watkins. It's called Finance is Not Free and Never Really Was. And he brings up how the existence of the Federal Reserve sends distortions throughout the entire economy. He says, it's hard to overstate the importance of this fact. The Federal Reserve is not just any old government agency controlling any old industry. It controls the money supply. And money plays a role in every economic transaction in the economy. If the government took over the shoe industry, we might have nothing but ugly Uggs and Crocs. But when the government messes with money, it messes up the entire economy. And he talks about this. He uses a pretty good analogy. Imagine you're planning a dinner party, and you're a well-organized person. You have an inventory of all the ingredients you need to make this dinner party. And say the night before your dinner party, you go to sleep and some prankster sneaks into your house and doubles all of the ingredient counts in your inventory, in your list. And then the next day you wake up, you look at your inventory, you're like, wow, I have a lot more food than I thought I had. I'm going to invite more people. Oh, my relatives are coming in from out of town. Surprisingly, I'm going to invite them. I'm going to make more food than I anticipated. This is going to be the best dinner party ever. And then you invite everyone over. You start making the stuff. You start making the dinner. You start making the casseroles and the pizza rolls and the brownies and the turkey, whatever you're making for your dinner party. And then it goes bust because your expectations were so high, your list was distorted. Now your dinner party is a total failure. And he talks about this when talking about how the Federal Reserve played a role in the stock market crash of 1929. He says, under the Austrian theory, the key mistake is for the central bank to inject new money into the economic system, typically by creating additional bank reserves. When a central bank creates additional bank reserves, it encourages the banks to lend out new money at interest rather than sit on a pile of cash that it is not earning a return on. To attract borrowers for this additional money, the banks will lower interest rates they charge on loans, leading to entrepreneurs to invest in plans they would not have been profitable at previous higher interest rates. But when the central bank pushes down interest rates by creating new money, the lower interest rate does not reflect an increase in genuine savings by the public. It is artificially low. And I'm not gonna read too much. I'm not gonna bore you guys with all the too many details of this essay. But it really does address it basically, a big reason why I like this essay is because there's so much history, but it also explains the fact that as long as we have a Federal Reserve system, and as long as the government is involved with controlling the money supply and artificially adjusting interest rates, then we're always going to have distortions and booms and bubbles and busts. And it's something that we're always going to have to deal with. And it is a result of government intervention in the economy that neither party really cares or wants to address. So clearly, first off, it wasn't free market capitalism that caused the stock market crash. It was Federal Reserve policy. It was government intervention in banking. But then we get to the myth that Herbert Hoover, was this hands-off, laissez-faire capitalist, let the free market work itself out president. So Herbert Hoover was this hands-off president. According to Great Myths of the Great Depression by Lawrence Reed, the crowning folly of the Hoover administration was the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Passed in June 1930, it came on top of the Fordney-McCumber tariff of 1922, which had already put American agriculture in a tailspin during the preceding decade. And the most protectionist legislation in U.S. history, Smoot-Hawley. By the way, again, what is it with Republican senators named Hawley being nationalist, protectionist knuckleheads on economics? The book goes on to say, tariffs on linseed oil, tungsten, and casein hammered the U.S. paint, steel, and paper industries, respectively. More than 800 items used in automobile production were taxed by Smoot-Hawley. And this is a big problem. This is why tariffs never do what they're aimed to do when they're done in the name of protecting American jobs, is because a lot of manufacturing in the United States relies on imports. So when it comes to the automotive industry and other industries, if they're relying heavily on imports to produce, and you artificially increase the cost through tariffs, through taxes, you're going to drive up the cost, demand's going to go down, and the people who work at these plants that are relying on imported goods, they're eventually going to be out of a job. He also passed the Revenue Act. Hoover also passed the Revenue Act of 1932, the largest tax increase in peacetime history. It doubled the income tax. And apparently Rexford Tugwell, who was one of the architects of FDR's New Deal, even said himself, we did not want to admit it at the time, but practically the whole New Deal was extrapolated from programs that Herbert Hoover started. So this notion that Herbert Hoover was just a hands-off, let the market work itself out president is a total lie. So we got that. Capitalism did not cause the stock market to crash. Herbert Hoover was not a hands-off, laissez-faire president. He was very hands-on, and his tariff made it worse. If we go over here, in fact, I forgot to bring this up. There's this whole essay from the Foundation for Economic Freedom about Smoot-Hawley, and how it actually resulted in a lot of bank failures, I believe tens of thousands of bank failures, because what happened in response to Smoot-Hawley is other countries placed retaliatory tariffs, which killed Americans, especially American farmers, that relied heavily on exporting, that relied heavily on overseas markets to sell their goods. And when a lot of these farmers suffered, additionally with the industrial industry that relied on imported goods to manufacture, when a lot of these businesses started to suffer, the banks that these businesses and farms were tied to, they were collecting less money and they started to fail as a result. Smoot-Hawley and the bank crisis. So yeah, I'll whenever I get this on YouTube, I will link to this article in the description down below. So check that out. I won't bore you guys with the details. So Herbert Hoover, again, was not a free market guy. And when he tried to manage the economy into prosperity, he just made it worse. And then we got to get to the third myth, this myth that FDR's brilliant economic planning rescued the American economy. And I actually addressed this in a recent video that where I responded to Kyle Kulinski, Secular Talk, making this point. It says right here, so freed from the worst of the New Deal, the economy showed some signs of life, referring to that meme just a few minutes ago. Unemployment dropped to 18% in 1935, 14% in 1936, and even lower in 1937. But by 1938, it was back up to nearly 20% as the economy slumped again. The stock market crashed nearly 50% between August 1937 and March 1938. The economic stimulus of FDR's New Deal had achieved a depression within a depression. And then, where is it? Moving on right here. At the end of the decade, the 1930s, and 12 years after the stock market crash of Black Thursday, 10 million Americans were jobless. The unemployment was in excess of 17%. Roosevelt had pledged in 1932 to end this crisis, but it persisted 2 presidential terms and countless interventions later. So there you go. Where is it? FDR, contrary to what a lot of people might lead you to believe, FDR and the New Deal did not rescue the American economy from the Great Depression. But now they're trying to rely on this other narrative that I brought up earlier. That during the 90s, the economy was booming, and it was. And it was all because, hey, Democrat President Bill Clinton was in office. And then the Republicans, like George W. Bush, they took over the White House, took over Congress. They lowered taxes. And because of deregulation on Wall Street, we got the Great Recession. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it was Clinton that repealed Glass-Steagall, the one of the big concretes they like to point to. Oh, Bill Clinton, he repealed Glass-Steagall. Or they don't know, they just say it was deregulation. The repeal of Glass-Steagall helped create the financial crisis. But again, Bill Clinton signed it into law. But the whole repeal of Glass-Steagall is a myth. As Watkins, I think Watkins wrote this essay too. Yeah, I think this is part of the same essay, actually. Did the repeal of Glass-Steagall make the banking system more fragile? When people say that Glass-Steagall was repealed, they're referring to the Gramm-Leach-Bailey Act of 1999. The GLBA did not actually repeal Glass-Steagall. Instead, it repealed Section 20 and Section 32 of Glass-Steagall. There was nothing banks could do after the repeal that they couldn't do before the repeal, save for one thing. They could be affiliated with securities firms. Under the new law, a single holding company could provide banking, securities, and insurance services, increasing competition, allowing for financial institutions to diversify. But this ignores another broader point. The 2 major firms that failed during the crisis, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, were pure investment banks unaffiliated with depository institutions. Merrill Lynch, which came close to failing, was not affiliated with a commercial bank either. Glass-Steagall had stopped commercial banks from underwriting and dealing securities, but had not barred them from investing in things like mortgage-backed securities or collateralized debt obligations. So even if Glass-Steagall were still in place, big firms like Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers would have still failed, while Merrill Lynch would have come close to failing. So that's just a whole myth. So now some people would say, oh, well, then Bill Clinton's off the hook for the Glass-Steagall aspect because, hey, it wouldn't have prevented anything had it stayed in place. But the fact is, Bill Clinton and his policies did have a role in creating the housing bubble. Starting in 1992, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were required to help the government meet its affordable housing goals by repurchasing mortgages made to lower-income borrowers. Over the next decade and a half, the Clinton and Bush administrations would increase GSE's affordable housing quotas, which over time forced them to lower their underwriting standards by buying riskier and riskier mortgages. And according to Peter J. Wallison, by 2008, before the financial crisis, there were 55 million mortgages in the United States. Of these, 31 million were subprime or otherwise risky. And of this 31 million, 76% were on the books of government agencies, primarily Fannie and Freddie. This shows where the demand for these mortgages actually came from, and it was not the private sector. So you can't even pin the entire Great Recession on George W. Bush when this policy started in the early 90s. But it is true that George W. Bush, see, this is another myth, is that George W. Bush was not a free market president. He was very involved in trying to get home ownership up in America. Now, George Bush wanted to make it easier to buy homes in America, in the United States. And he did help blow up the housing bubble that would eventually lead to catastrophe. But it ultimately started under the Clinton administration. As for the booming economy of the 1990s, I would say that the economy was booming. I'm guessing that it mostly had to do with the end of the Cold War and peacetime and the emergence of new trading partners. And I do think you could say Clinton does deserve some credit because he did open up international trade with NAFTA, although a lot of people on the left and right hate NAFTA and hate international trade. Also, I would just say the growing tech sector. I know a lot of people would say, oh, the dot-com bubble, it was a bubble and it was not sustainable. And that's correct. But at the same time, the economy of the 90s would not have boomed if it were not for companies like Microsoft and Apple and Dell and the growing computer industry in the United States that changed a lot of things for the better. But I don't think it's really fair to credit that to Bill Clinton. When in the middle of the 90s, they were actually trying to break Microsoft's legs with bullshit antitrust lawsuits. Also, I think you can maybe credit Bill Clinton for cutting spending, but that was probably more of a result of Republicans in Congress holding his feet to the fire. But then, yeah, so then in the 2000s, Bush was still hands on the economy. Medicare grew under Bush and the Republicans. The Department of Education, I think their budget tripled during this time. And they were heavily involved in housing. Not to mention, I mean, the Federal Reserve still existed during this time. Now, some people might be saying some stuff like, what about the fact that people on Wall Street tried to cheat the system with and the way they try to package mortgage-backed securities was shady and the credit default swap bubble made things worse. Even if I'm willing to grant you all of that, it does not change the fact that the roots of the financial crisis was government intervention in the economy, government intervention in banking and housing and the Federal Reserve, the control of the money supply. But even then, as Don Watkins points out, the role of derivatives fostering the financial crisis has been widely overstated. And he talks about credit default swaps and all of that. So I'm not really sure. I mean, you could still say, yeah, maybe there were a lot of scumbags on Wall Street that were doing shady shit that they should not have been doing. And even if I'm willing to grant you that, they never would have been able to do this if there was not government, if the government was not distorting the economy and creating all these bubbles by trying to make it easier for people to buy houses that they ultimately could not afford long term. So how should I wrap all this up? So I don't think it's fair to, well, so one, the economy should not be your central focus. Freedom should be your central focus. Which politicians are going to make the country freer? Which countries are going to get government out of my life other than protecting individual rights and property rights? Secondly, neither party really gives a shit about your freedom to begin with. And third, both Democrats and Republicans believe in some degree of government intervention. And they're both responsible for government. Historically, they're both responsible for economic recessions and panics. But it is also true that the narratives, when leftists try to say that Democrats are better at handling the economy, well, first off, remind them that that's not the proper role of government, right? Where in the Constitution does it say that government is allowed to, quote unquote, manage the economy? And secondly, inform them that the narratives that they base this argument on are total bullshit.